it seems like, of course, the institutional framework will relate a little bit to which policy areas are included, but it seemed like in the first session, most of the speakers were saying that at least in the long run, it might be likely that there will be some degree of regulatory convergence between the EU and the UK, which of course means that there needs to be an institutional framework which has means of monitoring and enforcement, and also, as we know, in the EEA, decision shaping. So today, in this session, we're going to explore the various different types of institutional frameworks, and the underlying question is, of course, could any of them potentially work for the UK? And our first speaker today is Alan Winters, Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory and Professor of Economics at the University of Sussex. And his talk is entitled Trade and Institutions, Ends and Means. Secondly, we will have Halvard Høgland Fredriksson, who is a leading expert on the EEA and Professor of Law at the University of Bergen. He will, of course, be talking about a structure that we know well here in Iceland, which is the two-pillar system of the EEA. And then finally, we will have Stephen Blockman, who is Head of EU Foreign Policy and Head of Institutional Affairs at SEPS in Brussels, and Professor of EU External Relations Law and Governments at the University of Amsterdam. And he will give a very interesting perspective as well from the EU's relationships with other European states. So I think we'll have the same kind of setup as we did in the last panel, and I'll ask the three speakers to come up, and then we'll have some panel discussions. Given that we're running a little bit late on time, I'll ask everybody to stick quite closely to the allocated time limits for their speeches. Thank you.
So, first of all, let me offer my thanks for being invited to lovely Iceland, my first time, and brief though it is, I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I come at this as an economist, I'm afraid, a trade economist, and the purpose of the title of the presentation is just to remind us that institutions are means, the ends are something different. I'm going to treat the end as being the trade relationship, but in the end, of course, trade is actually a means to something else. It's really important that we've got some idea where we're trying to get to before we build the institutions and the route to get to it. Brexit is basically de-integration, and I'm an academic. I thought, what do we know about integration? A couple of the early theories of European integration sort of sprang to mind. First is the sort of neo-functionalist view that somehow integration has an inevitable dynamic. You solve one problem, it creates another, you solve that, it creates another, and so it blossoms and blossoms and blossoms. The other sort of function, intergovernmentalism, was much more the governments are sort of in charge of this, they've got objectives, and one has institutions, you know, that help to achieve those objectives. I'm not going to say anything more about political theory, but it is, in a sense, it helps us, I think about some of the aspects of Brexit, because Brexit really has got a bit of both. What I want to ask, essentially, is sort of, what are the needs that governments think they are pursuing, and how inexorable are these spillovers from one item to the next? That means you really can't pull out one brick without the rest falling down. So at a practical level, what I'm going to be asking is sort of what are the institutions that are necessary to support the various levels of integration of trade that we've really talked about in the first session. Trade agreements. We're talking basically about a trade agreement. They aim to reduce costs and reduce uncertainty, or at least prior to Donald Trump, that was what we thought the idea of trade agreements was. And we want to do that because we think that reducing the barriers will increase trade and increase integration. That will boost average incomes, even if not everybody's income. One can cope with that separately. They may also, of course, be very good for other parts of cooperation. Certainly wouldn't want to deny that, but I'm not going to talk about it. So I'm just going to focus on the sort of trade issue. At the heart of this, there is an absolutely fundamental trade-off. Costs and uncertainties are mainly reduced by imposing constraints on governments. The most convincing theory we have of the GATT, the creation of the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, after the Second World War, why did the US, which was completely dominant, agree to have this set of rules that constrained it was they understood that if they could act in a totally unconstrained way, nobody else would want to play that game at all. There would be no trade relationship. There might be political repercussions to do with the communist regimes as well. The point is it was the USA deliberately tying its hands behind its back so that it would be a good partner. That is the fundamental issue. And you can think about a sort of hierarchy, if you like, of degrees of constraint that you impose upon yourself, which I've listed, and they are associated with declining trade costs, declining trade uncertainty, but equally well, declining what I've called short-run sovereignty. I'll just say a little bit about that at the end. But you can sort of agree how you're going to treat your partner, and if it doesn't work, you just walk away. You can have a dispute settlement process, which is without authority, without sanction, but at least creates a forum on which you could discuss differences. You can have dispute settlement with a degree of muscle, a degree of teeth. You can have joint binding decision-making. This is sort of getting towards the EU. You can have an external enforcement mechanism, for instance, the Commission in some respects in Europe, and the Court of Justice of the European Union. Essentially what we've got here is a trade-off between the degree of integration, the amount of trade and the boost to income that you get, with the degree of sovereignty. Now, what do I mean by that sovereignty? Sam mentioned it before the coffee break. You might think that you are sovereign. You might think that you can make every single decision yourself, independently, but it's not very efficient. Very hard work, very expensive, and typically all sorts of pressures push you into solutions. So, in a sense, the logic that people like I used during the referendum to argue about sovereignty was, no, we're pooling sovereignty, we're not giving it away. Collectively, we have a lot of sovereignty. Sure, we give up some stuff, but we gain a lot in others. So I'm not wanting really to talk and challenge that. I think that is something that we do get from these deep integration arrangements. But the point is, what all of the Brexit debate has been about is sort of short-run sovereignty. Can I decide to have bananas with less bend in them? Can I throw my tea bags in the trash and so on? Two examples from Boris, neither of which is true, actually. So, how does the UK view these trade-offs? I mean, in a sense, that was the subject of the first session. And the question is, if this is the fundamental trade-off, isn't that what the UK needs to take a position about? So how does the UK view this trade-off? The truth is it doesn't. It just has not made a decision about it. And in part, that's the previous government didn't really believe in discussing trade-offs. No one ever got up and said, on the one hand, on the other hand, it was all black and white. So we have a previous government for 3 years that didn't discuss trade-offs. The current government doesn't believe in trade-offs. All right, this is cakeism 1.1. We don't have to make decisions. Eventually it will catch up with us, but at the moment, the mantra still is, we can have our cake and eat it. But now actually it's really rather complicated. And you can think about it in terms of, sort of classical problems, being like trying to square the circle. The problem that the UK had was that right from the start, it's introduced a series of red lines. So that in October 2016, Mrs. May laid out 4 red lines, which 4 red lines, which, if you can think about this being the sort of solution space for the problem, the first one was we're going to cut immigration, and that ruled out a number of options because it essentially meant Britain left the single market because of the no cherry-picking view. We needed our own trade policy, and therefore we couldn't be part of the customs union. We wouldn't pay any money into the budget, remember that? Another area of possible solution ruled out. We would not kowtow to the European Court of Justice, another set of solutions that were ruled out. But it still left one place that it looked as if we might land, and that was a free trade agreement. It basically met those 4 red lines. Problem was, then we remembered Ireland. Actually, Ireland hardly figured in the referendum campaign. It hardly figured after the referendum campaign. My dear wife reminds me that I said on September the 5th, 2016, this is the issue that will get you. I never wrote it down, criminal offence for an academic, but in fact it was very little talked about. Problem with Northern Ireland, when we say, no, we have to do without, as Sam pointed out to us, not only a border, but any such checks, it rules out the set. The solution set is null in the technical terms that scientists use. There just doesn't seem to be a solution that meets those 4 red lines and the Northern Ireland border issue. So something has to give. And that, in a sense, is the debate that we're having now. Either the UK takes a sort of political view of sovereignty, of Brexit, but that leaves Northern Ireland high and dry. We just, if we are going to have a no-deal Brexit or something even a little bit less hard than that, essentially we are going to have a border or something like, an equivalent to a border in Northern Ireland. Alternatively, we can take a sort of economic view. This is very costly, we'll say. It's going to cost us 5% of GDP, 8% of GDP, who knows. Stick with the customs union, something like the single market, and that respects the Good Friday Agreement, but it reduces the UK's policy space. And remember that that's what, in a sense, Brexit was made out to be about. So that's the fundamental problem. We got this list, this hierarchy of things that we could agree to do. None of them seem to meet the set of policy red lines that we have, and yet we now are within 2 months of doing it, whatever it happens to be. So what I want to talk about for the remainder of the presentation is what are the institutions that might lie behind the different trade solutions that we adopt. So the institutional needs along the points on this trade-off. And first, what I've called a WTO Brexit. This is basically a no-deal Brexit. The UK is a member of the World Trade Organisation, as is the EU and everybody else, more or less, but there are no other trade agreements. The World Trade Organisation does offer some conventions about behaviour. It offers a forum, not only a negotiating forum, but the various committees for raising problems, trying to resolve things before you get to dispute settlement. It has rudimentary enforcement, a dispute settlement system, but it refers, principally, the WTO refers to goods. Services are included, but the GATS, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade and Services, is in fact a very weak instrument and not much regarded, if we're honest. It is, in a sense, the set of lowest common denominator rules. It's the rules that govern Nepal and British trade. It's not the set of rules that you might expect to be able to evolve between similar countries very close to each other. Of course, the key institution in all of this is the World Trade Organisation, an institution which many of you will be aware is under very serious threat at the moment. And not only is the dispute settlement process about to run out of juice because it's running out of judges, but indeed there's a sort of happy abandonment of the sort of set of WTO rules, GATT rules that have stood us instead for 70 years. Resurrection of the national security exception for imposing tariffs on passenger cars, for instance. But not just Trump, it's beginning to catch on elsewhere. The point I want to make actually is that even no deal WTO Brexit is not free of institutional structure. You need domestic institutions to administer the various WTO functions, including various legal structures. You've got to design policy, negotiate policy, enforce all your border formalities, administer the policy, like working out what anti-dumping duties ought to be. You've got enforcement for local standards, information points, and so on. So there's quite a lot that needs to be done. DG Trade had about 1,000 employees before Brexit started. It's not materially less complicated for Britain to do it by itself. We've got to learn about it. We need a pretty big structure in order to run just a simple WTO trade policy. It's important because if you've got bad institutions, you get bad policy. There's very interesting work on the way that different Latin American countries have handled the process of so-called administered protection, anti-dumping duties in particular. You can have a system that is very liberal, Peruvians did it. Pretty difficult to get anti-dumping duties. You can have a system that gives anti-dumping duties out hand over fist. Argentina at various points in its history. So getting these domestic institutions is actually quite an important issue. Next up along the line is really sort of simple free trade agreements. They offer preferential trade in goods. We reduce our tariffs on you, you reduce yours on us. We have different tariffs. It gives us rules of origin that we have to satisfy, which Sam and I would love to talk to anybody over a pint about, but I won't do it now. But otherwise, it's formally pretty much like the World Trade Organization. But even when you get to that stage, the sort of level playing field concerns that Larissa talked about start to rise. If we are going to open our market to you, how do we know that you are going to play fair? And if we want to go a little bit further than simple tariff preferences towards saying, well, we won't exercise anti-dumping duties against you, we really want to know that you won't cheat. So even the minute you've got tariff preferences, you're starting to slip into this slippery world of level playing fields. Typical free trade agreements have committees or commissions to discuss stuff, air differences. They have rudimentary dispute settlement, which permits sometimes a limited suspension of the concessions. It's intergovernmental usually, sometimes with bits of arbitration. As we see the WTO dispute settlement system falling apart, have to worry, and indeed experience suggests, free trade agreements have dispute settlement, but it's not very effective. Ultimately, you walk away if it's not working. Simple free trade agreements, say Chile and China, it's an 80-page agreement, 10 pages deal with dispute settlement. So dispute settlement is not insignificant, even in sort of the most basic of free trade agreements. Next along, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. Sort of example that we might use is the Canadian EU agreement. Much broader menu. It deals with goods, almost all goods. It deals with some services. It's got a little bit of mutual recognition and a bit of cooperation. It's as good as free trade agreements get. It is really a million miles away from the sort of integration that we get within Europe. CETA has got joint committees, it's got a dispute settlement system, it's got an investment court that has been chewed over for many years to make it consistent with the Court of Justice of the European Union and Canadian courts, but it still has largely the sort of set of border formalities that WTO trade requires. And if you look to see what the trade commissioners from Canada write about exporting from Canada to the EU, they say it's burdensome. It's a pretty depressing read if you think that's where we are going. Just to illustrate the point, don't try and read the words. That's the committee structure, that's the dispute settlement structure as summarised by the World Trade Organization Secretariat. Don't bother about it. But that is just a free trade agreement. It's complicated. Next stage, association agreements. I'm not going to say as much about these because my colleagues are going to come on to them later, but just to sort of to round up the story, this is typically a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, plus some other cooperation, which varies from agreement to agreement. It allows participation for the partners in some agencies and programs of the EU on EU terms. The EU says this is open, that's not open. And it typically allows some access to the single market where there is a regulatory and legislative approximation and where the partner is willing to recognise the role of the Court of Justice. Is this, it has the levels of government, it has summit level meetings, ministerial councils, association committees, trade committees. In the case of Ukraine, a recent one, parliamentary association committees, civil society platforms. It's got quite a lot of governance, quite a lot of constraints, quite a lot of debate, which at the moment is unfashionable in Britain. And it typically has arbitration of trade disputes. But arbitration of trade disputes subject to a very particular rule, which is only the Court of Justice of the European Union can interpret European Union law. Okay? So you can't argue about what the law means, the Court of Justice will tell you. You can argue about whatever follows after that. So pretty much these things mean you sign up with a fairly EU-centric view of the world. Now, people have suggested that the Ukraine model is a good one for the UK, but it characterises as being, it's going up the down staircase. The Ukraine is on its way in. It's accommodating, it's approximating, and each stage of approximation is rewarded with a bit more access. The UK, on the other hand, is really just going the other way. The idea is that we start off exactly in the same place, and by a series of steps, we do something that irritates the EU, and they do something to irritate us back by removing a bit of market access. What sort of relationship is that? The truth of the matter is, the Ukraine is not a model, because it goes in one direction, and Britain wants to go in the other direction. Finally, the European Economic Area. It's complete access to the single market, that's excellent. It gives you de jure sovereignty. You can pull out any time, if I understand it correctly. If you don't like that law, and you can say, well, that's it, no more single market. Ultimately, it's got budgetary contributions. And at least in the days when we thought this looked like a less satisfactory offer, in the referendum, people like me characterised as, they have to stick to all the rules, you have to pay, you have to contribute, but you have no say. And now, where are we now? But it's got a major limitation for the UK. Even the EEA per se doesn't work for the UK because of the Northern Irish border. We have to have alignment also in customs, because otherwise goods will come into Northern or Southern Ireland, pay one tariff, move freely to the other. Unless you've got some structure to handle that, indeed that border and equivalent checks are going to have to exist. So for the UK to satisfy its commitments on Northern Ireland, indeed it has to have EEA for all the regulatory stuff, at least in goods, and the something like the customs union. You'll remember that diagram. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much indeed.
What I'm going to say. Obey, pay, and no say. I wouldn't phrase it quite like that, but I think we almost agree. The topic given to me is the EEA two-pillar system, and the question I've been asked to answer is whether it can serve as an institutional template for the future EU-UK relationship. The very short answer to that question is probably not. At least not without considerable adjustment. I will use most of my 15 minutes to try to explain why that is so. Having said this, however, I would very much like to add that this does not mean that there are no lessons from the EEA to be of relevance to the UK. On the contrary, the reasons why the EEA or a setup similar to that of the EEA is unlikely to work for the UK are of course very relevant for the debate about the future EU-UK relationship. In any debate about possible relevance of the EEA to the UK, it's important to distinguish between the scenario where the UK actually accedes to the EFTA pillar of the EEA, and a scenario where the EEA only serves as a model for a new separate EU-UK agreement. I hold the first scenario to be quite unlikely for a number of reasons, not least the fact that neither the UK nor the EFTA states appear to see this as an attractive solution. I will therefore concentrate on the second alternative, the EEA two-pillar structure as a possible template for a new EU-UK agreement. But if there is something the Brexit vote has told us, it's probably that we should not rule out anything, so who knows. It's also possible, of course, to envisage some further scenarios, so to say, in between these two. You could have some kind of UK docking to the existing EFTA institutions, the EFTA Surveillance Authority and or the EFTA Court. It will at least solve the very obvious problem with an export of the two-pillar structure to the EU-UK, namely the fact that the UK pillar will only have one member. Another scenario where the EEA becomes relevant to at least a part of the UK is where Brexit leads to Scottish independence, and where Scotland will be in need of a sort of temporary solution that can secure access to the internal market, at least pending Scottish accession to the EU as a new member state. Not very likely, perhaps, but again, who knows? Anyway, the red lines mentioned in the previous presentation, I will come back to some red lines. But first, not the UK red lines, but the EFTA states red lines back in 1990 to 1992. The red lines for the dualist EFTA states, not Liechtenstein, but the dualist EFTA states were briefly as follows. No transfer of legislative, administrative or judicial sovereignty. Certainly not to the EU, and preferably neither to EEA or EFTA supranational institutions. As a consequence, it was impossible for the EFTA states to accept automatic incorporation of new EU legislation into the agreement, the executive power of the European Commission, and the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice. These were the EFTA state red lines. They sound very familiar to some other red lines, taken here from Theresa May's Lancaster House speech. I couldn't find any quote from Boris Johnson along the same lines, but I'm sure there must be somewhere, and I guess these red lines are still very much there. They are strikingly similar to the EFTA states red lines of 1990 to 1992. However, I would also like to stress that also the EU has its red lines, even though EU lawyers prefer to call them legal principles. They are often portrayed as completely non-negotiable by EU lawyers, who at the same time fail to recognize that the EFTA states' red lines are also, at least some of them, of a legal constitutional character. This may be because EU lawyers is used to think that national law, constitutional law included, always have to give way to EU law. So the EU's legal red lines appear to be absolute, whereas the red lines of any third country seeking access to the internal market, they have to be bent. The EU red lines, in short, no interference in the EU's internal legislative processes. Back in 1990 to 1992, this was a particular concern of the European Parliament, because Parliament was strengthening its position at that time, and it was afraid that any say of the EFTA states would weaken the power that Parliament was getting. A common watchdog on top of the Commission was another red line, of course particularly concerned to the Commission itself, but I think all the EU institutions agreed. And finally, and importantly, a common court of justice was ruled out not by the Commission or by Council, by the Court of Justice itself in its opinion 191. These red lines on both sides led to the EEA as an attempt to square the circle, as we just heard, or as a mission impossible. The aim is full participation in the internal market without any transfer of sovereignty. And the institutional setup meant to square the circle is this two-pillar structure with the existing EU institutions to your right and the EFTA and then a couple of joint bodies in the middle, but as I will return to shortly, no common court and no common watchdog. And that is important. So the key compromises: no joint decision making, but at least some EFTA participation in the internal decision shaping. That is true, very often highlighted by at least the Norwegian government. I guess it's the same on Iceland. Access to Commission working groups, not to Council or to Parliament, but still access to Commission working groups. It's not unimportant. It is, however, not so exclusive, so it's sometimes portrayed, at least in Norway. And the EU has now recently been willing to give Swiss more or less exactly the same access in the new framework agreement. But of course we can compare with the withdrawal agreement, where the UK will be completely out, even if the withdrawal agreement enters into force, which is striking. There is in the structure possibility for EEA-specific amendments. It's possible to agree on amendments to these new EU legal acts, sometimes necessary for institutional reasons, but the most important thing from a polity perspective, substantive adaptation is very rarely accepted by the EU, at least as far as Iceland and Norway is concerned. Liechtenstein has an advantage of being very small and has managed to secure quite far-reaching exceptions, but that does not apply to Norway or Iceland, and it will certainly not apply to the United Kingdom. There is a veto right, very important for constitutional reasons, reasons of sovereignty, but of course it has a catch. The EU may respond by suspending the affected parts of the agreement. It has never been put to the test. It's referred to in internal EU documents as the nuclear option. And as a result, 25 years on, 12,000 legal EU acts have been taken into the agreement, and the veto right has never been used. And now I just learned that the Icelandic Parliament is discussing the third energy package, so we'll see how that goes. That was the legislative process. What about dispute resolution? The most important point I will make today. There is no judicial dispute resolution mechanism in the EEA agreement for cross-pillar disputes. There was supposed to be a common court, but it was struck down by the ECJ, and as a result there is no common court. That is a considerable weakness in the structure of the EEA. And compare with the new Swiss framework agreement, where there is such, we can debate if it's good or not, but there is a common court, which then will refer matters to the CJEU, that's right. And compare with the EU-UK withdrawal agreement, where the Court of Justice in Strasbourg will retain its position, its jurisdiction. Also quite striking. That's different from the EEA. There is an independent EFTA court for the EFTA pillar, but it has not the same position as the CJEU in the EU pillar, unfortunately, perhaps. Its opinions to national courts are advisory, not binding. Its rulings in infringements proceedings are binding, but there's no lump sum payment or penalties like in the EU, and so on. And this is why is that so? Why is the position of the EFTA court somewhat weaker than the position of the EU Court of Justice? The EU accepted, again for reasons of sovereignty, the EU accepted some of the prerogatives of the national courts of the EFTA states. In my view, we can debate this. There is a debate going on, but be very brief. The reason why this works is because all players, just like you just said in your intervention, it works because all players acknowledge that the authoritative interpreter of the common EU-EEA law is the court in Luxembourg, the EU Court of Justice. Small differences may be tolerated, but this system wouldn't work if the EFTA court suddenly decided to interpret the rules completely different from the CJEU. The EFTA court has never done so, but if it did, the system would break down. Effect of EEA law, perhaps a little bit outside the institutional structure, but really important for the EFTA states. No transfer of legislative powers, no direct effect. But this is compensated by the fact that both Iceland and Norway has implemented the entire main part of the agreement in international law, and they're under an obligation to implement relevant secondary law, directives, regulations, and so on. And at the same time, the EEA agreement actually does have direct effect in the EU pillar. That is quite interesting, otherwise it wouldn't work. And this is a very important point, often overlooked in the debate. The EU has accepted that the EEA agreement has direct effect in its pillar, but it has no direct effect in the EFTA pillar. This is very different from more recent agreements the EU has entered into. The EU-Canada agreement is very clear that it will not have direct effect in either pillar. Not in Canada, not in the EU. Reciprocity. And the EU-UK withdrawal agreement is equally clear that it will continue to have direct effect, both in the UK and in the EU. Reciprocity. So this is very pragmatic EU approach back in the early 1990s, accepting that direct effect is not acceptable to Norway and Iceland and the other dualist EFTA states at the time, and the EU accepted that. I'm not so sure if they would accept that today if the EEA agreement was reopened and renegotiated. That could be a very hot topic. This only works because the lack of direct effect in the EFTA states has been remedied by national law, so that it has, at least in Norwegian case law, 25 years on, we don't have a single case, not one. We don't have one case where the lack of direct effect has been decisive for the outcome. So there is no direct effect, but it doesn't matter. And for that reason, it's acceptable to the EU. It could be different in Icelandic law, but I will not go into that. As to surveillance, the story is much the same. We have the EFTA Surveillance Authority as an independent watchdog of the EFTA pillar. It cooperates with the Commission. It has proven its independence from the EFTA states and has gained the trust of the Commission. I think that's a very important point, even though this independence is sometimes questioned. And on the EU side, we have the EU Commission. Important, the EU Commission is also making sure that the EU member states apply EEA law. So there is reciprocity. There's a recent challenge with the EU agencies. They, in a way, threaten the two-pillar structure. That's a long debate. I will not go into that. I will instead come to some of my conclusions. Why has the EEA worked? And I have a very unacademic and unlegal answer. It has worked because both sides really wanted to work. The EFTA states, this is important, the EFTA states got to cherry pick their access to the internal market. That was mentioned by the foreign minister in his opening address. The EEA is about cherry picking. The EFTA states got full access to the market and were able to keep fish and agriculture out of the deal. It's a wonderful agreement from that perspective. You take the two most sensitive sectors you have, you keep them out of the deal and you get access to the rest of the market. That's quite a thing. But you give up the right to participate in decision making. Circumstances have allowed for pragmatism also on the EU side. These are just some of contributions. I don't think I have time to go into those. I will instead come to my final slide. Can the EEA work for the UK? Well, in theory, yes, but only with sufficient amounts of pragmatism, trust and loyal cooperation on both sides. The main problem will of course be, will the UK accept the fact that the rules are made in Brussels? Is it possible to have a pillar with only one member? Well, perhaps you could dock to the EFTA institutions and solve it that way. And then there is the problem with the EU agencies. So, in short, I don't think the UK can use the EEA as a template. They can use parts of it. But I think the Swiss agreement is probably a better template, and perhaps we'll hear more about that now. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the kind invitation to come back to Iceland. Always a pleasure. I've taken this little cartoon just as a cover, really, to lighten up the atmosphere, but also to make the point, and I don't want to sound pedantic, that Brexit is only one dimension of the EU's neighbourhood relations. And I've been asked to talk a little bit more about this wider picture, where perhaps Britain sits in the middle, but is, of course, subject to all kinds of dynamics, not just on the transatlantic side, but also much further afield in the east. Like the previous two speakers, who've in fact covered all the ground that I should have talked about in this session, I want to start with a legal point and then maybe diverge a little bit or go further than what the PowerPoint presentation suggested and dig out one of the crucial points which was mentioned by the previous speaker, which is dispute settlement and the potential future mechanism for EU-UK relations. Article 8, however, for the European Union provides a legal mainframe for setting, as a legal footing at least, for creating a special relationship. That's actually the language of the treaty. Not just for a specific bilateral one, but in a more general context for all neighbours. An area of prosperity and good neighbourliness, you know, the land of milk and honey that the peace project seems to be after. But good neighbourliness, and this harks back a point, of course, which had been made earlier on, brings the Good Friday agreements in very acute focus. Founded on EU values, which in principle, of course, for the EU-UK relationship should not be a problem. Pourvu que ça dure. More importantly, I think from an institutional point of view, and subject of this panel are the institutional arrangements. Article 8, in fact, provides no specific detail as to what the specific agreements that it mentions, how they should be stopped by the institutions that govern it. It only says at the very bottom that the implementation of those neighbourhood agreements will be subject to periodic consultation. And of course there we've seen plenty examples already mentioned by the two previous speakers as to the association councils, as to the association committees, subcommittees, parliamentary committees, and dispute settlement mechanisms as the main organs to govern the bilateral relationship. In fact, Article 8 provides the legal mainframe, but then the specific legal basis for either a trade agreement, Article 207, development issues, Article 209, humanitarian aid, 214, readmission agreements, 79, paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, or any foreign policy issues, security and defence issues, Article 37 of the EU agreement, can all provide additional legal basis for the European Union to set those contractual relations for the future. Now, Article 8 is typically served as a legal basis for association agreements, including DCFTAs, deep and comprehensive free trade areas, arrangements for the countries belonging to the Eastern Partnership. In particular, 3 of them, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. The Ukraine model was already mentioned, of course, when referring to Barnier's staircase of doom. The 3 DCFTAs are arguably the widest and perhaps deepest FTAs concluded, certainly with neighbouring states, which is the geographical focus that I will take in the short presentation. Article 8, however, need not to be, as it is currently only serving those Eastern Partnership states and further ENP countries, or not to be limited to those countries itself. In fact, the treaty says that it might be over to micro-states, and why not in the future indeed the UK, with additional legal basis drawn from elsewhere in the treaty, as I mentioned. The European Neighbourhood Policy, which complements this neighbourhood clause in the treaty, shows a great level of differentiation in its implementation as well. I already mentioned the 3 DCFTAs, where Georgia clearly is still the front runner, and in fact its Prime Minister in the Association Council in March of this year suggested that it might apply for EEA membership, which may be a far cry from where reality stands at the moment in Georgia, as well as the EU and the EEA countries. Nevertheless, it shows that not only Brexit, but also other dynamics might exercise the EEA club in the next few months or years. And here I very much agree with what the previous speaker says. I think the 3 countries that make up the EEA, plus Switzerland as an EFTA country, will close the circle in order to keep the trust-based system working for themselves, rather than opening it up to power sharing arrangements by offering veto rights to microstates or far-flung Eastern Partnership countries. The point I'm trying to make on the ENP is that not only do you have 3 DCFTAs who differ in, of course, their level of approximation to the EU amongst themselves, you have the other Eastern Partnership states that so far do not have the benefit of such a DCFTA. On the Mediterranean side, you have the progressive Meds, if you want, that are negotiating a DCFTA, whereas you have the failed and conflict states on the other side. So priorities really diverge also, not just from the EU perspective, as well as from those countries' perspective. Looking at the overall playing field around the EU itself, it becomes clear that you have an increasingly complex collection of different types of association agreements, all, I would argue, in various states of suspended animation. The EEA seems firmly locked, although we wouldn't be having this conference, I think, if we wouldn't be exercised by certain doubts as to the future of the EEA. Will the UK eventually join? Will there be some type of special associated status, perhaps, under EFTA? Will Georgia, and in its wake Ukraine, apply for EEA membership? If the UK doesn't join, might it be able to negotiate more favourable deals that the EEA countries have with the European Union? Those are certainly questions that will continue to occupy minds, not just in the EEA countries, but also the EU. Switzerland, as was mentioned, has negotiated under pressure, of course, of Brussels, and after its referendum on the extension of free movement of persons to Bulgaria and Romania after their accession to the European Union, a chapeau, a comprehensive agreement which goes on top of the 120 20 plus bilaterals, some of them connected through so-called guillotine clauses, which make their operation not only less dynamic as we see in the EEA context, but also dependent on full compliance from one agreement to the next, where a comprehensive agreement has been negotiated, including the creation of a common court, but where ratification discussions, at least, seem to be stuck in Parliament in Bern, and where the EU and certainly the Commission are trying to send a signal with an eye to Brexit, of course, to Bern in trying to discipline it to accept that comprehensive agreement, but where that standoff seems to spiral downward in all kinds of retaliatory measures and completely stuck at the moment. The Western Balkans, none of them are likely to join within the next decade. That may not be relevant immediately, you would think, from a Brexit perspective, but what it does is create a reality, at least for the next decade, whereby these countries' relationship with the European Union will be governed by the stabilization and association agreements with their governance models. Even if Macedonia is given the green light to start accession negotiations later this year, which is a big question mark, it will not join the European Union by 2025, which was the date that Juncker gave to the frontrunners in that process. Turkey, exercised by negative dynamics, moving further away with an accession process frozen, and already escape routes having been found through bilateral agreements which may in themselves, of course, be modernized over time. And then the UK, where I agree, the logical end state, as things stand now, would probably be a Swiss type arrangement, but then things in the EU and the wider neighbourhood are set to change over the next couple of months and years as well. And so whether the Swiss model as we know it now is indeed the landing zone for UK-EU relations in the future, I'm not so sure of. At least I think we should entertain the question whether that will be the landing zone that we will be looking at. The European Commission has already started a new consultation round on its Eastern Partnership and may do so for the next in the next year or so for the European Neighbourhood Policy. It is, as I mentioned, looking at the Turkey and the Swiss arrangements. Things may change, and even if the policy frameworks as such do not seem to be out of sync with each other, I think one thing which is common if you look at all of those association agreements from a contractual point of view is a certain baseline which comes back to the wider regulatory space defined and monitored and enforced by the European Union institutions, and in the very last instance, its judicial backstop, if you want, institution, the European Court of Justice. And I think, therefore, that ought to be the blind spot that we ought to focus on in the next few months, and especially in case of a no-deal Brexit, that issue will become much more pertinent as future bilateral relations take shape. Here I take comfort in at least one paper which has come out of DEX-EU in the summer of 2017, rather. There was a whole raft of papers, and most of them were dismissed by the European Commission as not satisfactory. There was one paper on dispute settlement and enforcement which actually made quite a lot of sense. And so it's worth looking into that again, even if the political rhetoric around it was perhaps not the most helpful. UK government, then Theresa May's government, of course, saying that it was intent on ending direct jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union, seemingly implying that indirect jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice would be acceptable to the UK government. And in that paper it seems also that DEX-EU is flirting with the idea of an EFTA-like solution for dispute settlement without, however, spelling out the inherent choices and consequences of such a future settlement model, dispute settlement model. And here, therefore, I think it is worth spending a few moments, to think about what that might mean. And I'm helped by the previous speakers' observations that as far as any future agreement covers EU provisions, the court, as it will be asked under Article 218, paragraph 10 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, for its legal opinion on the conformity of any future bilateral agreement with the UK, will closely observe the autonomy of the EU legal order, which has been sacrosanct since the early days of the European integration process, and consistently applied in the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and will make sure that the court in Luxembourg, has the final say over the interpretation and validity, certainly over EU provisions. As far as the other elements of what Theresa May called a deepened special partnership between the EU and the UK might be, we simply don't know yet what they might contain. But assuming that that might contain elements which are not fully covered by EU law, one might foresee a sort of joint committee structure that was already referred to, which in a quasi-judicial manner, i.e. a negotiated matter, as we see in the joint committees, the association councils that govern the association agreements with, for example, Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, that might provide a softer mechanism basically to negotiate a way out of the dispute if it arises. But here I should stress that the presidents of both the European Court of Justice as well as the EFTA Court in a joint publication stressed that they would rather see the EFTA court system being applied as the preferred model for dispute settlement mechanism, as a dispute settlement mechanism for the future EU-UK relationship. And one sees, of course, from their own perspectives, why they have suggested that. I think I'll stop at this moment, looking at the time, and look forward to observations from the commentators.
Please notice that the museum shop and the cafe will be closed in 20 minutes or 5 o'clock. Thank you.
We're receiving a warning. They're saying that they're going to close the building in 20 minutes. So we better be quick. But thank you very much for these very clear presentations on such a complex topic. And I was struck by something that Ellen Winter said, which was bad institutions equal bad policy. So and I think there's definitely some truth in that. So this is definitely something which is important to get right. We have as well an excellent panel with us today. We have Georgina Wright, who's a
I've just shown how technically not savvy I am, and I'm very well renowned in my think tank for being that person who just doesn't know how to work a computer or anything, or a microphone, obviously. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was really struck in the last presentation how it feels like we are a step too far in the process, in the sense, oh, I have not done anything.
We're going to shine the lights on in a minute as well, aren't they?
Yeah.
They really have to.
Hello, alright. With the whole of Brexit, it's very difficult sometimes to feel like we are seeing the wood from the trees, but I think when it comes to structures, and I know that I wrote a piece back in early 2017 about how the UK could dock into the EFTA institutions. But what do you do when a country doesn't really want a structure or a relationship that is structured by institutions or hasn't really thought about that yet? And I think that when we are thinking about sort of the future, it is very difficult to know how it's going to work if you don't know what you want. And if you don't know what you want, I think the first thing that you need to do is identify your interests. Why do you want to cooperate with, the EU, with neighbouring countries? You need to identify mutual interests, and you need to identify their interests. And I think this is valid for the UK, I think this is valid for the EU, and I think it is valid for those non-EU EEA members as well, when it comes to Brexit. I would say just briefly, I think it's always worth reflecting how the EU kind of reacted to the referendum. Just before 2015, there was a real kind of engouement, so like a real willingness in Brussels to be thinking about how you could broaden and deepen the internal market, and particularly how you could improve relations with third countries. It was partly embedded in this view of differentiated integration, so those member states that wanted to do more should do more, and those that wanted to do less should do less, and then how could you involve those countries that are not EU members in that without giving them the same rights and without granting them the same rights if they don't have the same level of obligations. But there was a real willingness to kind of think creatively about the future. But then obviously the referendum happened. Initial shock, oh my goodness, as big member states voted to leave, but still there was this sense of optimism of maybe we could use this as a model. But obviously since then the politics have become particularly toxic, and that has stifled, in my view, any creativity. And when I travel around member states and I talk to Brexit coordinators, and I often say to them, it strikes me that you know what you don't want, but it strikes me also that you don't really know what you do want. And that is because it is very difficult for the EU as a predominantly legal structure to be thinking outside of conventions of structures and institutions. And that, I think, is going to have to change. And by the way, I'm talking about the EU, but obviously this thinking has to happen in the UK as well. What I will say is that for someone who works on Brexit, a bit like Sam, in fact, Sam, I'm surprised you didn't bring up one of your reports. This is something that think tankers generally do in the UK when they focus on Brexit. But I am looking at, or I'm writing a report on kind of how the UK can engage the EU after Brexit. And obviously engagement, it's not just about accessing information, which was picked up a little bit sort of in the Norway model, the EEA model, how you access that information, how you build those relations, but it's also about influencing policy outcomes. But again, structures grant you access, automatic access to certain venues that you won't get if you don't have an institutional framework. Just ask Switzerland. But given that the UK, and particularly this government, is not really there yet and is not thinking about structures, I think we have to take a step back and almost go into the basics, which is what are our interests, what are our mutual interests, and how do we go from there? So slightly, perhaps a bit of a downer on all these great models, but my sense is we can't really answer which one is best because we're not there yet.
Thank you. Could I ask Christian to say a few words maybe about, particularly about a model that we all know being the EEA-EFTA state's particular model, but also maybe if you had any ideas on how, so if the UK, and now Georgina's saying that we can't find a model for the UK, so maybe I'm going one step further by saying
Thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I actually would like to use also a bit the presentations that we just heard to answer your questions. And I think it has been a very important message that institutions are means to enable integration. But I think what we know about, what we have learned about from the EEA agreement is that the institutional framework is not is a necessary condition, obviously, that it works, but it's not a sufficient condition that it works. I think it is very important that we have to keep also in mind the capacity of the states that are integrated in such an institutional framework, their power, but also their political context. I think what Halvard has said, that the EEA wouldn't work for UK, and I think it would work perhaps, as you have mentioned, trust and loyalty. It would work in that context if the UK if it would be possible for them to replicate the political context of the EEA agreement. Then it would work. So I think this is very important that we have institutions on one hand, but you also need they are just a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. And this is quite important to know. And what we also have, talking about the EEA and also this two-pillar model, which has been quite impressive in this presentation, is this, that the institutions are needed for the entire policy cycle. So they are in charge to ensure this decision shaping, so the integration in EU policy making, but they are also important to select the EEA relevant rule and also to adopt it, to surveillance, the surveillance authority, but also interpretation and also dispute settlement. So you can see what a huge task it is and that you also need different institutions. And I think this is also something which we have to keep in mind. The higher the level of integration it is, the more elaborated the institutions are. And I think this is also something which depends on the policies that are at stake. And here perhaps also a minor remark to the last presentation regarding the Swiss-EU institutional agreement, this draft. This does not apply to all the bilateral agreements. So as it has been mentioned, there are about 120 of those agreements between Switzerland and EU, but this draft institutional agreement between Switzerland and EU only applies to 5 of them. 5 of them which are mostly linked to the internal market, where actually there is the highest need for this kind of institutional cooperation, where this is the highest need for dynamic cooperation in here. And I think this is also something which we also have to keep in mind, the specific context of the policy area where integration takes place, and they demand something differently. And just to make the final point, to come back to the first presentation of Mr. Winter, you have to define this scale of kind of sovereignty, or trade-off sovereignty you have mentioned that. And I think this is a very important point, and this is also something which we have, if we look in Iceland, or if you can compare also the EEA-EFTA states. Liechtenstein, for instance, is enabled to use the entire scale. Liechtenstein is enabled to, as Halvard has mentioned it, as a monist country, is enabled to delegate legislative power to new institutions. Norway is not, Iceland is not. So they have somehow legal and constitutional, but also political constraints on regarding these scales. And this makes it quite challenging sometimes to find the proper solution. And I think if I would be the UK, and if I would look for a future, for a model for the future relations, I would keep the ability to use this entire scale, dependent on the policy that are at stake, but especially for very technical policies, it is very important that you are able also to delegate sovereignty, legislative power to another institution.
Thank you. Just before we continue, how strict are we? Are they going to lock us in here in 10 minutes, or?
I don't think so.
No.
I will let you know.
Okay. I see. Okay. Thank you.
I don't think
so many unclear factors at this point, which makes the discussion on all this very speculative. And there are so many issues that are still unclear. For example, how the UK will exit the European Union with a withdrawal agreement or not. But as regards the two-pillar system of the EEA agreement, the EEA agreement with its two-pillar system has worked very well and been successful with the EU pillar and the EFTA pillar and the joint bodies. And we should have in mind that it has survived several treaty amendments from the EU side. And when it was signed in '92, the EU side had 12 states and the EFTA side had 6 states. And now, 25 years later, the EU side has still 28 states and the EFTA side has 3 states. But what we also need to have in mind here is that central in the EEA agreement is the principle of homogeneity, with its uniform implementation, application and interpretation of EEA law. And when it comes to that, having that coincides with the red lines the UK has set, and I must say I very much like the staircase picture that was in Randy's presentation. So the EEA agreement has worked very well for the EFTA states, for the cooperation with the EU, but having in mind the red lines of the UK and the principle of homogeneity, I'm not sure if that would also be successful for the future relationship between the UK and the EU.
Thank you. Thanks. I think in that context it was interesting to see that the EFTA states had some red lines to begin with as well, which have been presented. Is there anything really burning on the minds of the 3 presenters, or shall we open up for questions? Stephen?
I just wanted to quickly react to Georgina's point. I think for the EU, it's very clear already in Barnier's Steps of Doom what it would like to see as the preferred landing zone for this Brexit process, and that is an EEA-type model, because it would provide the legal homogeneity. It would, of course, preserve the autonomy of the EU legal order. It would set it up with a few institutions, and it would allow, in that sense, also for decision-shaping rights. We haven't touched upon that an awful lot, but one can think about ad hoc arrangements of a PCA, Political Security Committee +1, in ad hoc circumstances, just as we've seen other third states join the discussion for breakfast before they continue in the formal sense between the EU and 27. So I think for the EU, the EEA model seems attractive, even if it wouldn't, as Harvard also suggested, imply that the UK would join, but it would serve as a model. So the political climate, of course, of post-Brexit will determine ultimately what is acceptable in institutional terms. From the EU perspective, a community of law, I think, yes, this is preordained almost in the DNA of the organization.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up decision shaping. I think that's actually, we haven't talked about it enough, and it's very important. Georgina?
Can I just very quickly though react to that? I think there's just what I was trying to say is there is an assumption that that is where we are heading, but actually even the current government's decision to pull out diplomats from non-essential EU meetings while we're still a member state indicates that for many people in government right now that isn't seen as actually very important. So I'm just trying to kind of wrap it back to kind of what's happening right now, and And the discussions that are happening often in the UK are very different to the ones that are happening over in Brussels. And I think you're absolutely right, there are two things that are going to condition how we cooperate in the future. One is how we leave, and two is whether we go for one big arrangement or whether we go for a series of sectoral arrangements like foreign policy and trade, and then how we decide to go about that cooperation. But before we can even get to that, government needs to, what we say, it's not adapted yet to manage an enlargement in reverse. It has to figure out how it's going to do EU policy, it has to figure where that policy expertise is going to sit in government. It's not just about keeping that cooperation going, particularly under a no-deal scenario if that's where we're heading, but it's also about figuring out how we work together. But we can only do that once we've changed even our own machinery of government to adapt to that. And I think those building blocks and those steps haven't been taken yet before we get to how it would work with the EU.
Thank you. I think maybe we have time for one or two questions. Okay.
Thank you. Michael James Clifton, EFTA Court. I'm speaking in entirely in a personal capacity this afternoon. Two questions. One for Georgina. Your idea about how the UK could realistically change its perspective towards the EU as no longer being a member state. How do you think the UK could catalyse itself in order to start thinking about these things in a different manner? And the second question for Stephen Blockmans. On your last slide you had EEA 3.0. I just wondered if you could describe what you mean by that term. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hello, my name is Andrew Byrne. I'm the EU delegation here in Reykjavik. And my question actually is to Harvard. If I understood correctly, maybe I didn't, but when he was talking about decision shaping, he made a sort of off-the-cuff remark that he was surprised that there was no reference to this in the withdrawal agreement. Maybe that's because it's a withdrawal agreement. It's not the future relationship with the UK. So I'm just wondering if, isn't that sort of logical?
Anyone else? Final question?
I think Georgina is probably right for this government about thinking about institutional arrangements. And all good civil servants would have done a lot of this thinking. It may not necessarily have come out. I think the frustration in the UK was probably that Barnier, the models of doom, because it suggested that these are the models, and therefore there wasn't going to be something which was new and in sort of UK language reflecting what we think is and should be a special relationship. And one, I think, under this new government, which is probably based more on mutual recognition thinking rather than alignment. And I think, but I think actually thinking about what it is the institutional arrangement will be is just lost in the immediacy of withdrawal. In saying that, there's always been in the UK probably a mix of what is the future with withdrawal. So I can understand the confusion maybe about why I wasn't mentioned decision shaping. But ultimately, I think to come from a position where you are decision making, the UK has got to think about how much influence it can have in terms of decision shaping.
Okay, thanks. So if you'd like to briefly respond to the questions that have been posed. Yeah, Holger?
Well, to the question about the withdrawal agreement, I guess you're right. I can just say that as it is it is a withdrawal agreement. So perhaps the answer is as simple as that. I can just say that as an EEA lawyer, having read the withdrawal agreement, it's a very strict agreement. It's not pragmatic in any way. It's a very legalistic approach when it comes to the continuation of the jurisdiction of the court in Luxembourg, when it comes to state aid, when it comes to. So I'm just telling you from the EFTA perspective. I was a bit surprised that it was really necessary for the EU lawyers to be so strict with that agreement. That's just my view reading it. And one of it is it so important to kick out the UK representatives from these bodies? Perhaps it is. Perhaps it is. I don't know. That's just my impression when I read the agreement. If you compare it to the EFTA, the EEA agreement, I would just add one very brief comment. When we talk about the EEA as a possible template, my point was the EEA as it is today is not suited to the UK. Of course, it's possible to reform the EEA so that it becomes suitable for the UK. That's a very interesting debate, but I thought that was not my topic today. But if you have better decision shaping, participation in decision shaping, if you add some sort of joint tribunal between the two pillars, between the EFTA court and the EU court, and so on and so forth, then of course. But then it's not the EEA of today, then it's a different EEA agreement, and that can serve as a template for future UK-EU participation. Agreement, of course.
Okay, thanks. Alan, I think
so let me comment a little bit, since I lived through it day by day, I experienced it rather than as a professional political scientist. I mean, I think the reason we're not talking about decision shaping is that politically it just hasn't been helpful to any side for the last 12 or 18 months. The withdrawal agreement is a withdrawal agreement. The EU is very clear, it doesn't want to talk about the future in any formal sense, just straight up and down, that's their position. Boris, of course, has absolutely no interest at the moment in talking about how you might make something constructive at the end. The EU is bad and we're leaving, so there. Mrs May. But in truth, Mrs May was in the same sort of position as Boris is in, but just covertly. She had the ERG on her right flank all the time, snapping at her, to have something in the political declaration that said, but of course don't worry too much about this, we'll be in all the meetings, we can discuss it, we'll be very cooperative, would not have been satisfactory. Remember that the political declaration could not have been too constructive towards a very close relationship. In the end, she didn't get away with her deal. She didn't manage to walk that minefield quite effectively. But I'm quite certain she felt very constrained from the right not to discuss, as it were, subtle, behind closed doors relations with the EU, because she realised it would create trouble with the people who, in the end, ultimately brought her down. So I think we, in a sense, we just got the wrong time to discuss this. When Brexit is over, then maybe there will be a complete change in attitude and we start, as it were, looking in the other direction. But at the moment, it seems to me that political constellation on the EU side, the UK side, all the various sides of the UK are such that no one has got an interest in having this conversation.
it's an interesting point. Stephen?
Yeah, there was a direct question on EU 3.0, which follows on from the remarks that were already made. I mean, if you consider the draft EEA agreement as 1.0, and then after the opinion of the court in the 90s, of course, 2.0, any change of that the UK accession would make to the structures of the EEA would be 3.0. I wanted to use the opportunity to just reply to why is it that the withdrawal agreement and the legal regime which is applied to the UK is so much stricter than the EEA-EFTA arrangements. That is, I think, simply to do with the fact that until the end of the transition period 2020, the UK will be a quasi-member state. It will accept all the rules, it will not sit at a table, but it will therefore have to apply, to the fullest extent, the EU law to which it remains bound until 2026.
For the best form of cooperation, you need political decisions, and that's everything from what Sam was saying earlier, the economic outlook. Do we pivot to the US or do we pivot towards the EU? And those political decisions matter because the lack of strategic thinking affects everything else. And it also matters for political accountability. I mean, civil servants can go so far, but actually then they need their ministers and secretaries of state to make those decisions. So what do you do if there aren't any political decisions? And that you've left the EU, so those normal processes of gathering that information, making those decisions no longer apply, and that's what I was referring to before. I think there needs to be lots of work in the UK, particularly in Whitehall, in our government, about adapting to that. And that's the first point. And the second side to that is that engagement continues in any case, even if you don't have a structure. And that's because we're neighbours, that's because we're going to have to react to events, and that's because we have mutual interests as well. We know that Prime Minister Theresa May had already increased resources across the EU. That's evidence in, I think, the Foreign Affairs Committee report. And we know also that, Boris Johnson has said that he would pull out diplomats from those non-essential meetings, but again, there is a question as to why he did that. Was it something that he was trying to sell politically in the UK to show that he was serious about leaving, which is what Alan was saying, or is it really a question of actually, I think they're wasting those time in those meetings? That's up for debate, I think. So finally, my point to conclude on, I think there is always a danger to assume that we know what government is thinking, what government wants, and I actually think there is a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes that you hear in evidence in Parliament that particularly the Foreign Office has been thinking about engagement, how you improve that, not only with the EU in Brussels, but also across the whole of the EU in different member states. And there's lots of really good thinking, but of course, at some point we'll need political decisions on what that structure looks like, but it's too early to say now.
Well, being a civil servant, I think that's an excellent point to end on. There's definitely a lot of work happening behind the scenes. I'm afraid we've more than run out of time, but I think it's been a really interesting debate, and I think somebody said how many days it has been since the referendum, like 1,161. 1,061, okay. But I still, despite that, I get the impression after today's discussions that really we're just at the kind of starting point.